Albert Speer was called the Nazi who said sorry. He was the only top Nazi who admitted guilt at Nuremberg, the only one who stood up and said, yes, I was responsible. He served his full 20-year sentence. He wrote best-selling memoirs explaining how a civilized man could serve a barbaric regime. Historians called him the good Nazi, if such a thing could exist. But his own daughter cracked open something the history books missed. The man who publicly repented for crimes against humanity couldn't even hug his own children. His remorse was intellectual and rehearsed, a performance, and the people who knew him best saw right through it. This is what Speer's family revealed about the man behind the apology, and what his daughter did that may matter more than anything her father ever said. The bargain that cost him everything. Before Albert Speer became a defendant at Nuremberg, he was something far more dangerous. He was useful, Hitler's personal architect, the man who designed the grand buildings meant to last 1,000 years. Later, as armaments minister, he kept the German war machine running long after it should have collapsed. Speer was the cultured Nazi, the one who could discuss classical music and Renaissance art while overseeing factories powered by slave labour. His intelligence made him valuable, his ambition made him blind. But here's what most people don't realise. His family paid the price for that ambition long before he ever went to prison. Speer was so consumed by Hitler's inner circle that his wife Margareta once joked she'd have to telephone him, announcing that Frau Speer wished to speak to Herr Speer. It wasn't really a joke. It was the truth dressed up to hurt less. Between 1934 and 1942, they had 6 children together, and Speer was absent for almost all of it. Not physically deployed somewhere, but emotionally unreachable. Present in the house, absent in every way that mattered. His children grew up with a ghost for a father. They just didn't know it yet. The bubble that was about to burst. The Speer children lived in one of the strangest places in Nazi Germany, Hitler's restricted zone at the Berghof, high in the Bavarian Alps, while bombs fell on German cities and millions died across Europe. These children watched American cartoons with Eva Braun. They played in mountain meadows. They had no idea what their father actually did. If you're fascinated by how Nazi families dealt with their impossible inheritance, subscribe. We cover these stories every week on History Hangover. This privilege came with a price they didn't yet understand. The Speers weren't just a wealthy family enjoying the mountains. They were living inside a carefully constructed illusion, one that depended entirely on the Reich's survival. And in the spring of 1945, that illusion shattered completely. Germany surrendered. Hilde Speer was 9 years old. Her youngest brother, Ernst, was barely 2. They expected their father to come home, now that the war was over. Instead, he was arrested, put on trial at Nuremberg, and sentenced to 20 years in Spandau Prison. 20 years. Hilde would be nearly 30 before her father walked free. Ernst wouldn't remember him at all. But Speer's imprisonment created something unexpected, a relationship built entirely on paper. And through those letters, his daughter would eventually force a confrontation he never saw coming. The letters that revealed everything. During his 2 decades in Spandau, Albert Speer wrote hundreds of letters to his children. It was his only connection to them, his only way to be a father from behind prison walls. Hilde, especially, maintained steady correspondence. She wrote about school, about friends, about the small details of growing up in post-war Germany. But in 1953, when Hilde was 17, she did something remarkable. She wrote to her imprisoned father and asked him to explain his guilt, not to comfort her, not to reassure her that everything would be okay. She wanted him to account for what he had done, to explain how a father, her father, could have participated in such evil. This wasn't a child seeking reassurance. This was a confrontation, and Speer's response revealed everything. He wrote back, of course. He always wrote back. His letters were articulate, thoughtful, carefully constructed arguments about responsibility and moral failure. He could explain his guilt in perfectly reasoned paragraphs. He could analyse his own complicity with the detachment of a historian examining someone else's life. But something was missing. His words had no heat in them, no genuine anguish. Reading his letters was like reading a legal brief about his own soul. Technically correct, emotionally empty. He could articulate responsibility without actually feeling it. Hilde kept those letters. She kept writing to him, but somewhere in that exchange, she began to understand something troubling about her father. His remorse wasn't transformation, it was performance. He had learned to say the right things because saying the right things kept him alive. First at Nuremberg, where admission of guilt may have saved him from the gallows, and later in the court of public opinion. The question was, what would happen when he finally came home? The reunion that failed, October 1st, 1966. After serving his full 20-year sentence, Albert Speer walked out of Spandau Prison. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The world wanted to see the Nazi who said sorry finally face his freedom. His children were waiting for him. They were adults now, the oldest in their 30s, the youngest barely remembering a time before prison. This should have been the moment of reconciliation. The father returns, the family reunites, the long separation ends. But that's not what happened. The reunion failed completely. Speer discovered something devastating. He couldn't connect with his own children. Not emotionally, not in any real way. The letters had created an illusion of relationship, but face to face, there was nothing. His own words, recorded later, are haunting. I cannot break through emotionally to my children. His son Ernst, who had been 2 years old when Speer went to prison, couldn't speak during visits, just sat there in silence. And Speer admitted the truth. I too had nothing to say, and it's sad, I still don't. Think about that. The man who wrote best-selling memoirs about Nazi guilt. The man who gave interviews explaining the psychology of evil. The man who could fill hundreds of pages analysing his own moral failures. That man couldn't have a real conversation with his own son. The walls he'd built around himself weren't just for the public. They went all the way down. The coldest house in Germany. In 1978, journalist Gitta Sereni visited the Speer home to interview him for a biography. What she found disturbed her as much as anything in his Nazi past. She described an intense aura of loneliness hanging over the household. 5 of the 6 Speer children had scattered across Germany, rarely visiting. The family home felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, cold, empty of real life. But the most revealing detail came during a family dinner. Sereni watched as the adult children arrived. Formal handshakes, no embraces, polite, distant conversation while Speer sat at the head of the table. The atmosphere was suffocating. Then Speer left the room, and suddenly, Sereni heard something she hadn't heard all evening. Peals of laughter. The children relaxed. They joked with each other. They became warm, open, alive. Speer's wife, Margaret, lit up, becoming girlish and gay in a way that seemed impossible moments before. The family functioned better without him. Speer noticed it too. He once asked Sereni with something like bewilderment, "Do you see how she lights up when they come? How she changes when I'm not around?" He could see it. He could even articulate it, but he couldn't change it. The emotional walls were permanent. Whatever capacity for genuine human connection he might once have had, he'd traded it away. First for Hitler's approval, then for survival, then for the carefully managed image of the repentant Nazi. By the time he wanted it back, it was gone. The question, without an answer. One daughter refused to let the story end there. Hilde had spent decades watching her father perform remorse without feeling it. She'd written him letters as a teenager demanding accountability. She'd witnessed the failed reunion, the cold dinners, the loneliness that seemed to follow him everywhere. But she still had one question, the question that haunted her more than any other. How could such a sensitive, basically kind person like my father, who had irony and humour, and in my experience was not particularly authoritarian, how could such a person find his place in this regime? She asked him directly. She asked him in letters. She asked him in conversations. And she never got a satisfying answer. Speer could explain Nazi Germany. He could explain the psychology of obedience, the seduction of power, the way decent people convince themselves that terrible things are necessary. He could explain it all, as long as he was explaining someone else. But he could never explain himself. Not really. not in a way that reached the human level where understanding actually lives. So Hilde decided to provide her own answer, not through words, but through action. The inheritance she refused to keep. When Albert Speer died in 1981, Hilde inherited something troubling. Artwork she suspected came from murdered Jews. Paintings looted during the very crimes her father claimed not to know about. She could have kept them. Many children of Nazi officials did exactly that, hung the art on their walls, told themselves it was just family property now. Let time blur the origins. She could have quietly sold them, taken the money and moved on. No one would have blamed her. No one would have even known. But Hilde did something extraordinary. She sold the paintings and used every penny to found Zurückgeben. The name means give back in German. It's a foundation supporting Jewish women artists. The daughter of Hitler's architect spent the rest of her life funding the very community her father's work had helped destroy. She didn't stop there. In 2004, she received the Moses Mendelssohn Award for her work promoting Jewish-German reconciliation. In 2015, at 79 years old, she opened her Berlin home to Syrian refugees, people fleeing a war zone, welcomed by the daughter of a man who once designed buildings for the most murderous regime in history. The verdict his daughter delivered. Hilde Schramm. She took her husband's name, distancing herself from Speer, never publicly forgave her father. She didn't write memoirs defending him. She didn't argue that he was secretly a good man who made terrible mistakes. She simply moved beyond him. And that may be the most damning verdict of all. Albert Speer spent his final decades trying to control his legacy. He wrote books explaining himself. He gave interviews shaping how history would remember him. He worked tirelessly to be seen as the Nazi who understood his guilt, who took responsibility, who proved that even participants in great evil could find redemption. But his own daughter, the person who knew him longest, who wrote him those letters, who watched him fail to connect with his own family, she didn't buy it. She didn't argue with him. She didn't try to expose him. She just quietly built something that mattered more than his performed remorse ever could. While Speer wrote about guilt, Hilde did something about it. While he explained his failures in best-selling books, she transformed inherited shame into action. The Nazi who said sorry left behind memoirs and interviews and carefully crafted explanations. His daughter left behind a foundation. Refugees welcomed into her home. A lifetime of work that actually helped the people her father's regime tried to destroy. History may remember Albert Speer as the repentant Nazi, but Hilde Schramm showed what real accountability looks like. Not words about guilt, but a life spent making things right. Not explaining evil, but actively working against its legacy. The daughter didn't forgive him. She didn't redeem his name. She simply became more historically significant than his performed remorse ever was. And that says more about Albert Speer than anything he ever wrote about himself. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the families of Nazi leaders and what happened after the war ended. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.